The President of the United States is the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces.
The Chiefs of Staff had to make the plan for the invasion of Japan without considering the atomic bomb. It was estimated that to land on Kyushu and conquer it would cost 250,000 of our youngsters to be killed and 500,000 of them to be maimed for life.
The projected casualty numbers that President Truman would use later in life would range from 250,000 to 1 million. That notion of putting 1 million lives at risk long ago became a central part of the argument for using the bomb, though the figure of 1 million has never been found in any of the briefings President Truman received from his military commanders. The real debate in the summer of 1945 was not whether an invasion would be a tragedy. It would have been. But there was no plan to invade for another several months. The real question was how to end the war without that bloody fight to the finish. There was a military option. There was a diplomatic one. And there was the bomb. The military option was to wait for the Russians to get into the war. In a secret agreement, the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin had promised Roosevelt that 3 months after the end of the European campaign, his Red Army would move against the Japanese occupying China. As early as April, U.S. military intelligence concluded that a Russian invasion could be decisive.
By the autumn of 1945, we believe that the vast majority of Japanese will realize the inevitability of absolute defeat, regardless of whether the USSR has actually entered the war against Japan. If at any time the USSR should enter the war, all Japanese will realize that absolute defeat is inevitable.
The Americans had also broken Japanese military and diplomatic codes. Reading the secret diplomatic intercepts known as magic, the United States knew that Japan itself understood what Russia's entry into the war would mean to them. In the spring of 1945, the Japanese foreign minister cabled his ambassador in Moscow.
It is a matter of utmost urgency that we should not only prevent Russia from entering the war, but should also induce her to adopt a favorable attitude toward Japan.
The Japanese ambassador in Moscow cabled back to Tokyo that there was not much reason to be encouraged.
It is hard to say whether the present eastward movement of troops is being carried out for the purpose of bringing pressure against Japan. We must be on our guard as soon as we notice any marked movement of troops towards eastern Siberia.
The increasingly urgent messages asked the Russians to help negotiate a surrender. Stalin ignores them.
Unfortunately, it now appears that we shall soon have to abandon our struggle on Okinawa. If Russia, by some remote chance, should suddenly decide to take advantage of our weakness and intervene against us with the force of arms, we should be in a completely hopeless situation.
75,000 Japanese had died on Okinawa. 13,000 Americans had been killed. As the Japanese war widows were presented with the ashes of their husbands, in Washington there were some people looking for a political way to end the war.
There were 3 things that were known in the government in Washington that were not known before the first bomb was dropped to the Japanese. One was the bomb itself. One was that the Russians are coming. And the third was that under terms and conditions to be agreed, the Japanese could keep the emperor.
That was the political option. Let the Japanese keep their emperor. And President Truman knew that everyone in the bitterly divided Japanese government would insist on it.
Policymakers who were advising Truman, those who were closest to Truman and for whom he had a great deal of respect, were saying, look, Mr. President, one way we can end the war as rapidly as possible is to modify our demand for unconditional surrender.
Our intelligence people, to a man, said, look, if you harm the god, they will fight forever. You must tell them that you're not going to do that. Say that he can be like the King of England. We won't harm him, won't have any power, but in some way make it very clear that that will not be the case, that he will not be harmed.
Lost in today's debate is the fact that military men were among the key voices urging a change in surrender terms. Admiral William Leahy, the senior military man in the White House who called the bomb that fool thing, argued there were military reasons for a negotiated peace.
Admiral Leahy said that he could not agree with those who said to him that unless we obtain the unconditional surrender of the Japanese, that we will have lost the war. What he did fear was that our insistence on unconditional surrender would result only in making the Japanese desperate and thereby increasing our casualty lists.
There were alternatives, and Truman and Stimson and Burns and the others were fully conscious of those alternatives. One was to wait for the Soviets to come into the war. One was to modify unconditional surrender. Another alternative was to use the atomic bomb.
Did Colonel Stimson have any doubts about
Not about using it, no. Using it against the city, if you'd pushed him, he would have said, well, we fought that battle, we lost it.
The next day, James Burns moved to settle the question that had been raised by accident and pushed for a formal vote.
The present view of the committee was that the bomb should be used against Japan as soon as possible, that it should be used on a war plant surrounded by workers' homes, and that it should be used without prior warning.
It's one of the myths that's persisted since the war, isn't it, that the atomic bomb was dropped on a military target. In fact,
well, it's not a myth, it's a military target. It's a military target like New York.
If there was a day when the bomb decision was sealed and delivered, it would be the 1st of June, when James Burns went to the White House to tell the president what the committee had approved.
But Burns was covering his bases here. As the president's personal representative on the committee, Burns was doing the job that he had been chosen to do, which is covering the president. Nothing from a political point of view is so advantageous as a committee of shared responsibility. Mr. President, here it is in writing. From the most experienced public men within this nation, from the best scientific minds, you are making the right decision. Do it. Do it quickly, and do it with no warning.
On the 6th of July, the president set sail aboard the USS Augusta on his way to a summit meeting in Berlin with Joseph Stalin and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. American troops had just fought to a very bloody victory on Okinawa. At the top of the president's agenda was ensuring that Stalin would keep his promise to President Roosevelt and send the Red Army to war against Japan within a month. In his pocket, the president carried the draft ultimatum given to him by Stimson, making it clear that the emperor could keep his throne if Japan surrendered. But at his side was his newly sworn-in Secretary of State, and James Burns argued that the president would be crucified politically if he made a deal with the Japanese.
We had the bomb. Now, had to make a decision as to whether we'd use that bomb on Japan or not. And that decision was up to me, because I was the President of the United States and we controlled the bomb.
In July of 1945, the president could still have said no. He could have done so during the Allied meeting in Potsdam, a suburb of Berlin, where he would first meet both Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin. Truman privately compared Stalin to the boss of the Missouri political machine from which he had come, and nicknamed him Uncle Joe. Stalin privately called Truman that noisy little shopkeeper. The Allied leaders knew they had to deal with one another in the world after the war. Truman had postponed their meeting until he was pretty sure he had the bomb. In the New Mexico desert, the gadget, as the device to be tested was called, had been moved to ground zero. General Groves was pushing hard to test the plutonium bomb. If it worked, the United States could produce half a dozen or more, creating a nuclear arsenal, and giving President Truman enormous power in his dealings at Potsdam. At Potsdam, the president writes in his diary about his first meeting with Stalin.
We had lunch, talked socially, Put on a real show drinking toast to everyone, then pictures made in the backyard. I can deal with Stalin. He is honest, but smart as hell. Most of the big points are settled. He'll be in the Jap war on August 15th. Finny Japs when that comes about.
The president seems to understand that he does have an important alternative to an American invasion of Japan. The Red Army's entry into the war might be the way to end it. He rejoices about the Russians in a letter to his wife.
I've gotten what I came for. Stalin goes to war August 15th with no strings on it. I'll say that we'll end the war a year sooner now, and think of the kids who won't be killed. That is the important thing.
At the New Mexico test range on the night of July the 15th, the men of the Manhattan Project would not get much sleep. Thunderstorms threatened to postpone the test. One scientist bet on the chances that the blast would ignite the atmosphere. He offered a side wager on whether it would destroy the entire world or only New Mexico. And then, just before dawn, at 5:29 on the morning of the 16th, the world changed forever. New Mexico sent a coded cable to Potsdam. Operated on this morning. Results already exceed expectations. Dr. Groves, please. For President Truman at Potsdam, this was newfound power. James Burns called it the gun behind the door. There was now no longer a need for politically damaging concessions to the Japanese. And overnight, no more need for Stalin and his Red Army.
Stalin doesn't know it, but I have an ace in the hole and another one showing. So unless he has 3 or 2 pair, and I know he does not, we are sitting all right.
James Burns went to work immediately on the draft ultimatum to the Japanese. He took out warnings about the Russians and the bomb, and he erased the crucial language suggesting the possibility that Japan might keep its emperor.
One gets a sense from these actions, interventions by Burns, and the acquiescence in it by Truman, that they are of a mind, I agree, that as Burns put it at one point, as recorded in his aide's diary, that the point is to get the war over as soon as possible so that the Russians, the Soviet Union, don't get in so much on the kill of Japan.
President Truman's diary raises the question of just how much he understood at the time.
This weapon is to be used against Japan between now and August 10th. I have told the Secretary of War, Mr. Stimson, to use it so that military objectives and soldiers and sailors are the target, and not women and children.
In fact, the target committee had made the decision to drop the bomb in the center of a city. Again, the president.
Even if the Japs are savages, ruthless, merciless, and fanatic, we will issue a warning statement asking the Japs to surrender and save lives. I'm sure they will not do that, but we will have given them the chance.
In fact, there would be no explicit warning about the bomb to the Japanese, and the Potsdam ultimatum would be issued the day after the military order to drop the bomb.
This is one time.
I casually mentioned to Stalin that we had a new weapon of unusual destructive force. The Russian premier showed no special interest.
Actually, Joseph Stalin knew about the American bomb long before Harry Truman. He had spies at Los Alamos in New Mexico. But he did not know the bomb would be dropped on Japan, and he would be stunned when he heard the news. President Truman was now in a hurry to leave Potsdam, according to James Burns' press aide, so he wouldn't have to tell Stalin why he hadn't kept his ally informed about the bomb. Once on board the USS Augusta, Burns' aide would add this.
The president took Burns by the arm and said, "Come on, Jimmy, let's go below and have a drink. If these sons of bitches want to see me again, they will have to come to Washington."
The bomb would be dropped on Hiroshima 4 days later.
I think the moral ambiguities in the use of the bomb come down to the question of when we used it and when we needed it to save casualties. Why we used 2 bombs in August to prepare for an invasion in November, when they were the only 2 bombs we had. We assumed there'd be a 3rd one in 2 weeks and a 4th one 2 weeks after that, but we
without that bloody fight to the finish. There was a military option. There was a diplomatic one. And there was the bomb. The military option was to wait for the Russians to get into the war. In a secret agreement, the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin had promised Roosevelt that 3 months after the end of the European campaign, his Red Army would move against the Japanese occupying China. As early as April, U.S. military intelligence concluded, reading the secret diplomatic intercepts known as Magic, the United States knew that Japan itself understood what Russia's entry into the war would mean to them. In the spring of 1945, the Japanese foreign minister cabled his ambassador in Moscow.
It is a matter of utmost urgency that we should not only prevent Russia from entering the war, but should also induce her to adopt a favorable attitude toward Japan.
To 1 million. That notion of putting 1 million lives at risk long ago became a central part of the argument for using the bomb, though the figure of 1 million has never been found in any of the briefings President Truman received from his military commanders. The real debate in the summer of 1945 was not whether an invasion would be a tragedy. It would have been. But there was no plan to invade for another several months. The real question was how to end the war.
The President of the United States is Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces.
The Chiefs of Staff had to make the plan for the invasion of Japan without considering the atomic bomb. It was estimated that to land on Kyushu and conquer it would cost 250,000 of our youngsters to be killed and 500,000 of them to be maimed for life.
The projected casualty numbers that President Truman would use later in life would range from 250,000, that a Russian invasion could be decisive.
By the autumn of 1945, we believe that the vast majority of Japanese will realize the inevitability of absolute defeat, regardless of whether the USSR has actually entered the war against Japan. If at any time the USSR should enter the war, all Japanese will realize that absolute defeat is inevitable.
The Americans had also broken Japanese military and diplomatic codes.